One of South Africa's great leaders, Chief Luthuli, once said, "Those who think of themselves as victims eventually become the victimizers of others." And so one of the, if you like, the challenges of history, how do we break the chain that turns victims into victimizers?
Today, with Net for God, we will follow in the footsteps of a witness for peace, Father Michael Lapsley, an Anglican priest from the Society of the Sacred Mission. Born in New Zealand, he was sent to South Africa in 1973, straight after his ordination, to continue his studies and to act as chaplain to the students on several university campuses. He was 24. It was here that he joined the growing struggle against apartheid. This political regime rejected all civic, economic and social equality between black and white people. During this struggle, he became a victim of an assassination attempt in 1990, which led to the loss of both his hands and the vision in his right eye. In 2011, he told the story of his journey towards inner healing in the book Redeeming the Past, My Journey from Freedom Fighter to Healer.
I never imagined that my own life would somehow become tied with the journey of the people of South Africa. I went on to join a religious order, to become a priest. Among my formative influences in my local church was the example of my parents and the local church in terms of welcoming people of different races. So early on, I had a non-racial vision connected to my understanding of what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. So that prepared me, in one sense, for South Africa. But I suppose that when I arrived in South Africa, I thought that I was going to find three groups of people: the oppressed, the oppressor, and the human race that I would belong to. And in a way, the rude discovery was that in one sense there were only two groups. There was the oppressed and the oppressor. I often say that the day I arrived in South Africa, I stopped being a human being and became a white man, because suddenly every single aspect of my life was decided by the color of my skin. I went to a building to sort out my student visa, and the building had two lifts or two elevators, and one elevator said whites only, and the other elevator said goods or parcels and non-whites. And that image has stayed with me through the years, because it somehow symbolized what apartheid was about. That we who are white were people, and black people, who of course are the majority, were like objects, parcels, things, goods, about whom we made decisions. At the heart of the apartheid nightmare was that all political power was in the hands of a white minority. If I could use the kind of figures of today, white people were about 5 million, black people were about 40 million. But we who are white were the only ones who had the vote. Even the last white constitution of the apartheid state had in its preface, guided by God from generation to generation.
Father Michael worked in Durban on the East Coast as chaplain in 3 universities, where he met and gave spiritual training to young students of all races.
One day I said to a black medical student, "I don't believe in apartheid." And he said to me, "Father, that's very nice. Where are you going to sleep tonight?" Of course, I was going back to my white suburb. So I could choose to be against apartheid, but I was choosing to be against it from the side of those who were its beneficiaries. The engagement was something that happened over time, but the events of 1976 were a turning point for me and my generation. Because it was in 1976 that black school children protested against having to learn their lessons in Afrikaans, which was seen as a language of oppression.
On the 16th of June 1976, 20,000 students met in Soweto, a suburb of Johannesburg, for a large peaceful demonstration and to say no to speaking the Afrikaans language of the white people. But in the face of the huge number of people marching, the police very rapidly began to fire into the crowd. 575 people died, among whom were many children. The fatal violence of that Wednesday, 16th of June, would spread throughout the whole country. Soweto became the epicenter of a racial movement that would never be extinguished.
Once the events of 76 happened, there were thousands of young black people imprisoned, detained, tortured, killed, thousands and thousands who left South Africa and went into exile, some of whom looking for military training, some of whom were looking for education that they had been denied inside the country. The thing that shook my faith to its roots was the recognition that those who shot children were people who read the Bible every day, people who went to church on Sunday and shot kids. And I myself had been a very committed pacifist up until that moment, and that I had believed that you could always get justice in any and every situation by non-violent means. But it was in the face of the killing of children specifically that my pacifism fell apart. So in that sense, I became like most mainstream Christians who are not pacifists, who are committed to peace, but believe there can be exceptional circumstances where the use of arms can be justified. So in that sense, I then joined the African National Congress of South Africa, the organization of Nelson Mandela, and became a chaplain, a pastor, priest within the liberation movement.
The ANC, the African National Congress, had been fighting for the promotion of civil rights for black people since 1912. But in 1961, confronted with the failure of a strategy that had been non-violent so far, Nelson Mandela created a military branch which led the movement into armed resistance. Arrested and imprisoned for life on Robben Island, Nelson Mandela became the international symbol of the struggle against apartheid.
I often think of an interview with the president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, who's asked about the armed struggle, and his voice reduces to a whisper, and he says, "They forced us into it." And when you read the history, it's unparalleled in any Western country, in the sense that it was 50 years of non-violence on the part of the people before they came to the reluctant conclusion they had to pick up arms. But during those 50 years, more and more violence had been used against the people, but also the language which people use mystified the reality. So, for example, when the state used violence against the people, it was called the defense of law and order. When the people picked up arms, it was called violence and terrorism. So the very words obscured the reality of what was actually happening. But I believe that whenever people pick up arms, however justified it may be, there's a moral cost to be paid, a moral injury that is done. As human beings, we're not hardwired to kill each other. We are made to live together in peace and harmony and as sisters and brothers.
Father Michael, now elected as the National Chaplain for Anglican students, publicly denounced the injustice of apartheid, the abuse of arrests and the use of torture. The regime expelled him from the country. With the agreement of his community, in September 1976, he went to Lesotho and then to Zimbabwe. He was thus forced to live outside South Africa for the next 16 years, while still exercising his work as a pastor and continuing in his fight against apartheid as a part of the ANC. And from there he travelled round the world to make known the issues of justice and truth in that nation.
It was the work of seeking to mobilize the faith community internationally, to assist the faith community to see that at stake in South Africa was the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because either apartheid was true, that the most important thing about us is the color of our skin, or the gospel is true, that we're all made in God's image and likeness. But both couldn't be true. So that was my theological work, but also I was involved, if you like, in delegitimizing, unmasking the claim of the apartheid regime to be Christian. Now, when I went to live in Zimbabwe, at one point, the Zimbabwe authorities came to me and they said, "We have information that you are on a South African government hit list." And for several years in Zimbabwe, I lived with armed police guards 24 hours a day. It was my theology that was a threat to the apartheid state. And I was saying across the world, apartheid is an option for death carried out in the name of the gospel of life. And in a way then, by seeking to kill me, they illustrated my point. And it was in April of 1990, 3 months after Nelson Mandela had been released from prison, that I received a letter bomb in the post from the apartheid state.
It was on the 28th of April 1990, at his home in Zimbabwe, that while opening a package containing 2 religious magazines, a bomb exploded in his hands. Father Michael lost both of his hands and the vision in his right eye, and his eardrums were shattered.
And yet somehow I felt that God was present with me in that experience. I also felt that Mary, who watched her son being crucified, understood what it was that I was going through. People sent messages of prayer, love, support. People of faith, people of goodwill from across the globe. And for the first 4 months, I was as helpless as a newborn baby. And step by step, I had to begin to rebuild my life. Coming to terms with the permanent character of my disability. I remember having seen an icon, and the icon showed Jesus with one leg shorter than the other. So it pictured the Messiah as disfigured, and that picked up the image from Isaiah about the suffering servant being disfigured, marred beyond human semblance. And for me, that was spiritually helpful as I came to terms with the fact that physical brokenness in some respects was going to be the story of the rest of my life. I think the prayer and love and support saved me from hatred and bitterness and desire for revenge. You know, if something horrible is done to us, we're victims. If we physically survive, we're survivors. But often people still remain prisoners of moments in history. And so, with God's help, through the prayer and love and support of so many people, I was able to take the next step to become victorious. Victorious in the sense of being able to continue to help create the world of my dreams.
Father Michael's convalescence in Australia, then in Zimbabwe, lasted for over a year. However, from 1990, the dawn of a new era seemed to be breaking in South Africa, with peace talks underway between Nelson Mandela and Frederick de Klerk, who became President of South Africa in 1989. Convinced that he had a role to play in the healing of the nation, Father Michael chose to return to the land that he hadn't seen since 1976, even though it seemed like a crazy decision. In trying to re-establish his personal contacts, he met Desmond Tutu, the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town in the south of the country. Archbishop Tutu gave him his support and allowed him to exercise his ministry in the diocese, and in 1993 to become the chaplain at the Trauma Centre for Survivors of Violence and Torture.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one or another.
When Nelson Mandela became the first democratic president of South Africa, it was almost unbelievable. We were bearing witness. We were part of this extraordinary moment of transition from the nightmare of apartheid to the beginnings of a democratic state. And in some ways, my own journey is a mirror in its own tiny way of the South African journey, because there was the period where we had to fight to slay the monster, but now there was a different period. It was now the time to reconcile, to heal, to rebuild. We had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and that commission gave us a giant head start in facing our woundedness.
For more than 4 years, at the hearings organised by the Commission, thousands of those guilty revealed the crimes they had committed in the name of apartheid and obtained the forgiveness of the nation, and many victims came to forgive. By exchanging truth for reconciliation, South Africa, little by little, freed itself from apartheid and avoided a bloodbath.
In my case, no one has taken responsibility for what happened to me. So I haven't forgiven anybody for what happened to me. I said I'm not full of hatred, I'm not bitter, I don't want revenge. But that doesn't mean that my healing journey hasn't started. I've been traveling my healing journey all through those years. But of course, there's still unfinished business. But perhaps when I return to South Africa, someone will knock on my door and say, I sent you that bomb. Will you forgive me? Now forgiveness is on the table. What do I say? Yes, no, not yet. Perhaps I would say to that person, excuse me, sir, do you still make letter bombs? He says, no. Actually, I work in the local hospital. Will you forgive me? Yes, sir, I forgive you. And I would prefer you spend the next 50 years working in that hospital rather than be locked up in prison, because I believe 1,000 times more in the justice of restoration than the justice of punishment. So often when we say justice, we mean punishment, if not revenge. There's another kind of justice, the justice of restoring relationships. But then having said, I forgive you, perhaps we would then sit down and drink tea together and say to my new friend, well, sir, I've forgiven you, but I still have no hands. My eardrums are still shattered. I still only have one eye. I'll always need someone to assist me for the rest of my life. Of course, you will help pay for that person, not as a condition of forgiveness, but as part of reparation and restitution in the ways that are possible.
In 1998, in Cape Town, after his own experience and conscious that millions of other people had suffered terribly, Father Michael Lapsley established the Institute for Healing of Memories. He provided space for the victims as well as perpetrators of violence, so that they could tell their stories in expression workshops in order to overcome their trauma. Today, Father Michael travels the world to promote this work of healing.
We need as a generation to face the wounds of the past. We need to be able to speak about our pain. I remember a particular woman who came to a workshop, and it sounds a horrible thing to say, but what I recall is I noticed the ugliness of her face. And she told a story of her son who had been killed 15 years previously. But as she told the story, it was like he was killed 5 minutes ago. So her life had stood still for 15 years. And at one point in the workshop, I said to her, what kind of life do you think your son would have wished for you? And in the process of the workshop, she didn't start to forget him, but she began to let him rest and began to see that her life needed to continue. And on the last day of the workshop, I could have walked straight past her because the lines of her face had changed. She had become radiant. There is a story in the Gospel of John, the story of St. Thomas the doubter. And you remember the story that the disciples are in the upper room, the doors are locked. Thomas is present, and the risen Christ appears. He says to Thomas, put your hands where the marks of the nails were, put your hands in my side. And Scripture says that Thomas says, my Lord and my God. So one of the things we see in that story is that the risen Christ was also the crucified Christ. The wounds were still visible, but the wounds were not bleeding. And I believe that tells us something about God's invitation to us, is that we should continue to recognize, acknowledge the woundedness of what we've done to each other, but that the wounds have to stop bleeding. And that's what happens when healing takes place. If you like, it's the invitation as individuals, as communities and nations, not to be Good Friday people who continue to crucify each other, but to be Easter Day people who rise to new life, when yet the wounds are visible. And so my wounds, they're visible, they're dramatic, but they're not bleeding.
This month, let us pray for Father Michael Lapsley, for his ministry, and also for all those who work for reconciliation and the healing of memories of people throughout the world. The word for this month is in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 5. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed.